各族裔法轮功学员遍布全球。是什么力量在吸引着不同文化背景的练功人？请随大海访谈，了解他们对自然、社会与人生的看法。约瑟夫，你好，很高兴您给我们这样一个机会，来分享您的生活经历和想法。那我们先来聊一聊您的成长环境和生活背景吧。
All right. And it doesn't seem to be that much different than for most Americans. I was born somewhere, raised somewhere, and went to college somewhere, and had no real major events, no traumas happen in my life. I was born in Florida to an architect and the daughter of a farmer, and we moved to the city where my mom's parents had their farm when I was in grade school. For junior high and high school, we went to Southern Illinois University, where my father was a professor at the university for several years. And then to get away from being around the parents all the time, I went to California for college. And then shortly thereafter, my sister went out to California as well. And from there, I went into computer science as study and then as my career. Was there in California for 20 or so years. Met my wife there, married. Then we were in Atlanta for about 15 years, and then we've been here in New York for less than one.
那您的祖先他们是从哪个国家移民到美国的？
On my father's side, I had a very distant cousin that traced our family back 10 generations to Germany, Heidelberg, I think. So we know ancestors traced back 10 generations, so to about 1650 or so. My mother's side, mainly from Czechoslovakia. So middle Europe for my mom's side of the family, the ancestry there, and Western and Northern Europe for my father's side of the family. I've got a little bit of English, Scotch, Irish, German, there's, I think, a little bit of French blood in there somewhere, and then Eastern European, again, primarily Czechoslovakian, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some Yugoslav or Romanian in there as well.
您能说多种语言？
I can speak and understand a bit of many, many different languages. When I went to college, I spent about 10 years or so singing with various singing groups that specialized in medieval music, and we sang in many different languages, and of course I had to understand at least what I was singing. In high school, I took German for 4 years, and then of course here with having married my wife and dealing with my mother-in-law, I've had to learn at least some Mandarin Chinese. So I know enough Mandarin Chinese spoken and listening and speaking to be able to make sure that children are fed and clothed and are to bed, and a few other things adults talk to each other about in Chinese. Roughly the same amount of expertise in German, and I'm able to sing and speak, reading off of a page in several different European languages and a few other languages as well, but not with any understanding of what I'm saying.
您的家庭就是一个多元文化的家庭，那您家里经常是吃中国餐呢，还是美国餐呢，还是欧洲餐？
Pretty much depends on which of us is cooking. My wife prefers to cook for the household, and she and my mother-in-law both would prefer to eat Chinese food whenever possible. I grew up learning how to cook various forms of mainly European foods. So if I'm cooking for the family, it ends up being pastas, soups that are Western in in flavor and in orientation, Mexican, Italian, European, Southern European primarily. And when my wife or my mother-in-law cook, it's Chinese. And since both of them grew up in Guangzhou, which is very much a major port city, they have a lot of, they really enjoy their seafood and they know how to cook fish well. I've been vegetarian since my early college years, so I don't know how to cook meat. I don't know how to cook fish, and I would prefer not to have to learn. So my wife, when she cooks for us, she cooks primarily or fully vegetarian, and that way all of us can eat. As my daughters were growing up, they learned how to eat vegetarian, and they learned how to eat fish and meat. They've learned to eat a wide variety of foods and enjoy them. So it's food for me most of the time. It's food, and I eat it, and it takes care of that. I believe it was age 20 when I started as a vegetarian, and I'd always been leaning that way anyway. And partway through my sophomore year in college, the dorms food was getting less and less good. I guess they were trying to get to the back of the meat lockers to clean it out or something. And there was one week where even all the confirmed carnivores were avoiding the meat dishes. And at that point I said, I compete better in my sport when I'm not eating meat. I feel better when I'm not eating meat. I sleep better when I'm not eating meat. Let's just make it official. I had known that many of the various spiritual disciplines that have been throughout the world, India, a lot of Christian ones, incidentally, Buddhic and Tao, a lot of Tao traditions as well, emphasize not eating meat as a way to get rid of being attached to having meat or having to take on responsibility for killing animals. So I knew this was a part of a lot of different traditions, and it made sense to just go ahead and get started and continue on with it. I've not seen any real need to stop being vegetarian, so I've just kept on with it.
您以前去过中国哈，那您对中国是个什么印象？
I had grown up in the Midwest in relatively small towns and spent summers on my grandparents' farm. And I was very used to the idea of not having all that many people around. When I went to China, it seemed like every time I turned around, there was the equivalent of several busloads of people within view. It was very different than what I was used to. Now, having been to many different countries before then, I knew that every country, every locale has its way of doing things. It has its own background, its own history, its own way of experiencing the life in the world. So I knew this was just a natural part of this part of the world. It still took me a while to get used to it, but that's a different issue. I really did enjoy being able to see that large variety of people that was there. The places that we went to in Hong Kong and Guangzhou and Beijing, very different from what I was used to. Very, very urban. There were days where I did not see a building that was less than 6 stories tall, which was very different from after having had lots of summers where the tallest thing would be the corn in the cornfield I was running through. And it was definitely different. I definitely knew I was in a completely different part of the world, but it was okay because it was my wife and then my wife and my mother and father-in-law with me pretty much the entire time. And it was great.
那这么说，您在就是以前接触法轮功之前就接触过中国的文化，对吧？
Yes, but not in the way that most people would think. When I was growing up, I was very interested in spirituality and actually was seriously for several years considering training for the priesthood. So I looked at lots of different cultivation, what I now know as cultivation paths, spiritual paths, religious paths. So throughout my childhood and growing up, I saw many different styles and types of what I now know as cultivation, spiritual improvement through established practices. So I very quickly learned about many different types of traditions, such as the Buddhist tradition in India, which has yoga, various forms of yoga. I learned about Taoism and Buddhism as it is seen in China and Japan. I learned a lot about Christianity of various times and places from pre-medieval Europe onward through to modern Europe. I've seen about Lutheranism, several other forms of Christianity as it is expressed in Europe and in the Americas. So I was exposed to a lot of different spiritual paths, and I knew that all of them were valid ways to learn more about the divine, how to be a good person, how to be helpful to those around me, how to become more spiritual and thus more of a benefit to the world. But I did not really choose one. I knew that while I was growing up, I needed to learn about many different things, but it did not feel like the right time to actually choose one while I was still growing up. Though, as I say, for several years while I was growing up, I was thinking about training for the priesthood, so that was one path I knew was available to me, but it didn't feel like it was the right time to dedicate myself to just one path while there was so many others that I could at least look at and see which one do I want to put my time as an adult into.
那您是怎么样接触到法轮功，开始那个练法轮功的呢？
My wife and I got married in 1996, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law, of course, came over from China to us to California for the wedding. My wife and I honeymooned in Hawaii, and my parents-in-law joined us for the first week that we were there. About a year later, I'm not quite sure exactly what it was, my wife came to me and said, Mama has just told me about a meditation practice called Falun Dafa. Would you like to find out more about it? And I said, yes, sure. And so my wife talked to my mother-in-law, who was back in Guangzhou at the time, and about, I'd say 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, there was a cassette tape of the exercise music with an English overlay. And then probably about 3 or 4 weeks later was the first of several different translations into English that I have read of Zhuan Falun over the years. So for me, it was just a very natural part of life. My mother-in-law came across it. I'm not quite sure how. She'd have to tell you the story herself. And then my wife told me about it. She told her daughter, my wife, about it. And my wife told me about it. And I said, yeah, look into it further. And I got some of the very earliest English translations of things and very quickly fell into meditating and studying in Dafa.
那您刚才说，您在这之前也了解了很多什么道家的呀、佛家的很多修炼的事情。那您觉得法轮大法、法轮功和这些宗教啊、其他的这个冥想啊、打坐呀，或者是 yoga 呀，有什么不同的地方呢？
All of the practices that I saw were either where you had to be completely unconscious when you were meditating, or you did not have a specific focus in mind. You did not have conscious, I guess, a conscious control over what was going on, or even a conscious awareness. So for Taoism, for a lot of practices from what Western Americans would call the Orient, the East, the meditative practices are you're completely unaware of what's going on. A lot of the Christian disciplines of meditation, of self-improvement, some of them are the same, where you have to be in trance. Others are, you just continue to live your life, and you think back on anything you might have done that was wrong. In the Roman Catholic Church, that shows up specifically as the practice of confession. And gradually stop making mistakes. And to me, that seemed, both of those approaches seem to be, they would get me where I wanted to go, improving myself spiritually, but that seemed like they were going to be too slow. I wanted to know what I was doing. I wanted to know what improvements were going on. I wanted, where I could, to avoid others' mistakes. When I went through college, I trained as a research scientist, so I very much knew that others' experience distilled into knowledge and distilled into wisdom are very helpful, so that we do not need to start at this, we don't need each of us at this start from scratch and invent everything from scratch. We can stand on, the American idiom is standing on the shoulder of giants. You can start from much further along if you know what has occurred in the past, and you can build on what's been available.
您的意思是说，在西方宗教中修炼使人成长的速度很慢，是吗？
I felt that they were slow, either because I couldn't tell what was going on, or I would only be learning from mistakes that I realized were mistakes.
可以举些例子吗？
Okay. In the Roman Catholic Church, there is the rite of confession, where a person goes into a small booth, tells the priest, here's what I've done, here's something that I think I did wrong. And they talk back and forth. When something was done that you need to atone for, then the priest says, do these specific prayers, and here's some ways you can make it less likely that you'll do this again. And that seemed like that would be relatively slow path, because only after you've done something and you realize it's something you need to talk about and you're willing to talk about it, can you find that atonement and start going beyond the sort of the trial and error, trying to figure out what is a proper way to do some aspect, to living your life. So I felt that would be taking that sort of path for my spiritual work would be very slow, and it would feel clumsy to me, especially since I trained, as I say, I trained as a research scientist. So I always, in my training for research, knew I needed to think ahead. I needed to see lots of different possibilities, and then try to reason through ahead of time what might happen, what should I be doing. And to my mind, as a scientist, fumbling around blindly was not as productive as some of my research friends at the time said, fumbling around, but not blindly. And I felt it much better to be able to stay focused and be able to apply my mind and what wisdom I had already to self-improvement, to improving myself spiritually, than to just simply blindly or unconsciously trying to improve.
那练了法轮功之后，您的精神上和身体上有什么变化呢？
I wouldn't say there was much in the way mentally that changed, other than feeling like I had a very good path to go upon. I did have physical changes, which I knew were possible and in some practices were to be expected. When I was starting to do Falun Dafa meditation, I had tendonitis on both sides of both forearms that was slowly but progressively getting worse. That was from doing, as a software developer, spending a lot of time typing, and I was spending a lot of time working with my hands in very repetitive ways. So tendonitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, things like that are occupational hazards for software developers if they're not careful. And I wasn't all that careful. Shortly before starting cultivation, as I say, I had tendonitis in both sides of both forearms, and progressively I was finding the tension that was causing the tendonitis was going up my arm. About, I'd say, 4 or 5 weeks after I started first meditating with that tape with the English exercise instructions dubbed over it, I had an attack of tendonitis that made it very difficult for me to use my hands for anything. The skin on the backs and fronts of my forearm were very tight. I had lots of tension. I could bounce quarters off of my arms. It was that bad, and the tension was going up through my shoulders and was causing me headaches because the tension was traveling up onto my scalp and then down my back a little bit as well. At that time, I had been going to see a friend of my wife's father, who was in San Francisco at the time, who gave Chinese herbs and acupuncture. And I had been going through a course of acupuncture and Chinese herbs from before I found Dafa. And it was making it so his treatments were making it so it wouldn't progress as quickly, but it was still having trouble. After I started with the meditation practice, I found that I was slowly, the tension was going away, the relaxation was happening, and several weeks after starting the meditation and doing this in earnest, as I mentioned, I had my tendonitis flared up. And then after the next time I sat and meditated, it flared a little bit more and then went away. And from there, at that point, the tendonitis was gone. I didn't need to do the acupuncture treatments. I stopped taking the Chinese herbs, and, thanking him, of course, for the work that he had done, because it had helped keep it from getting too bad. That's my major story of physical improvements. There's been subtle improvements that have happened physically and mentally as well, but most of those I could talk a little bit about, but they don't seem all that major and not something that's out of the normal for anyone who's consciously trying to improve themselves, whether physically, mentally, or just as a citizen in the world.
听说练法轮功的人能看到一些特殊的东西，你有这方面的体验吗？
Yeah, I've had experiences which many people would say, extrasensory or seeing other dimensions. I've had those throughout my life. So the ones that I've had while practicing in Falun Dafa haven't been unusual or strange to me. There have been flashes of seeing scenes of people in other places of the world or in what seem to be other worlds, and they're all pretty mundane to me. I have had 3 or 4 experiences where I would think that others would think of them as spiritual revelations or spiritual experiences. And I have had, as I say, I've had 3 or 4 of those in my life. One from before Falun Dafa, 2 more as I was helping others learn more about Dafa, and then one just, I have no idea what triggered it, but it happened. So I've talked with many other people who have had experiences like that and coached a few of them who this is the first time that they had been exposed to the idea of there's more than what we can see and touch. And
你认为那是很真实的？
yeah,
Oh.
they are definitely real. They're a part of reality that are not objectively confirmable, but they are subjectively confirmable across many, many different people, many different cultures. So while as a research scientist, I would not be able to point to this, this experience can be explained by this way in psychology or psychiatry. I know it is a valid, common, almost universal human experience because I've been exposed to enough cultures in their descriptions of what they would consider to be spiritual events, spiritual experiences, that there's something there, and it is as real as the air we breathe. And to deny that because I cannot objectively confirm it is to deny a large part of what I already know and have experienced is reality. So I already knew from my training, even from early on as a research scientist, is there's a lot about the world that I will not be able to treat professionally as a research scientist because science cannot say anything about it, or at least not say anything coherent and with any integrity.
那您学了这个法轮功哈，您觉得您就是这些科学解释不了的东西都能得到答案吗？
What I had read in Zhuan Falun matched what I understood from seeing the explanations given in many different cultures and in many different experiences. It meshed well with what I had experienced and deepened my understanding on certain aspects. I was like, I don't know why I see sometimes it's blurry, and sometimes it's sharp, sometimes I can see a wide field of view, sometimes it's narrow, sometimes there's more senses than at other times. Sometimes I can control it, sometimes I can't. It's not easy to explain, but each time I've gone through and read Zhuan Falun, I would pick up some aspect of what my experiences had been and see a little bit more about, okay, how might I look at it more broadly? How might I understand it from a different or at least a slightly different angle? I've had a wide variety of experiences during the now 25 years, I guess, 25 years of cultivation in Falun Dafa. I have had the opportunity to take part in many different events throughout the world. I've had experiences like that pretty much everywhere I've gone. There's always some small kindness to others around me that I can do that helps make life easier for them, helps reduce the stress, and helps them be able to focus more on getting their work done or in improving their ability to improve themselves. So I see it as this is part of what is expected of me as a citizen of the world. Wherever I happen to be, I need to be available and help others, and then, of course, let others help me, as one should.
非常感谢您哈，有时候今天你花了这么多时间，跟我谈了这么多，我很受益。
Quite welcome. Thanks.